Okay, folks, I think we can start. Right, Gray? We can start? Okay, we can start. I got the official word. So good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. This is just a great crowd here for, I think, what's a really, really important subject. I'm Dick Morningstar. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the chairman of the Global Energy Center here, and I'm really pleased to welcome all of you for this conversation on energy innovation as it relates to concerns about national security and about economic development. And on behalf of the Atlantic Council, I want to thank Nathan Associates for their generous support of the event and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory for co-hosting the event with us today. And I also want to particularly thank our esteemed director, Sherry Goodman, and Tom Morehouse. And where's Tom? I saw you a second ago, way back there. He's always trying to stay out of the limelight, I've found. And Greg Duquet, who really are the godparents of this, I think, very, very important event. And as the Trump administration's 2018 budget proposes an increase in defense spending of $54 billion, I think this is an important and timely topic. Military operations are incredibly energy intensive, and discussions regarding energy innovation are key to sustaining our technological and military competitiveness. The U.S. military continues to demonstrate commitment to alternative sources of energy, communicating the important contribution of renewables in improving energy security and resiliency in military operations. And matters of energy resiliency are particularly important in combat zones, in training areas such as deserts here in the United States, which have been literally too hot at times to do training, naval operations centers, Norfolk, and in remote areas such as the Arctic. And further, and you'll be hearing more today, strategic partnerships between the private and public sector enable sustainable economic and infrastructure development that's vital for securing U.S. military strength, technological edge, and leadership. So today, our expert panel will discuss the importance of public-private sector collaboration as it relates to energy innovation. The panelists will also consider how improvements in distributed energy generation, microgrid technology, energy storage enable energy self-sufficiency and sustainable economic development in remote regions that are important both for military operations in certain areas, but also the effects on economic development in many parts of the world. So these advances do have significant implications, both for our national security and for reducing instability around the world. And the whole interrelationship, I think, between energy technologies, lowering emissions, and national security is just a really important nexus that not enough understand, and I think it's a way to talk to those who are not terribly excited about dealing with climate issues. So I'll quickly introduce our moderator, Sherry Goodman, and then she'll introduce the rest of our esteemed panel. Let me just say that Sherry is a very valued director here on the board of directors here at the Atlantic Council. Currently, still a senior fellow, right, at Woodrow Wilson International Center, and at CNA, as well as, and I mentioned here, and most recently, you've served no longer as President and CEO of the, last I knew you were President and CEO of the Consortium for Ocean Leadership, so, this is an informal introduction, by the way. I have to check with Sherry, just, I need to make sure. make sure this is accurate. And Sherry's previously served as Senior Vice President and General Counsel of CNA and is the founder and Executive Director of the CNA Military Advisory Board, and last but certainly not last, probably, but not least, served as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, responsible for global environmental, energy, safety, and occupational health programs and policies at the Department of Defense. So, again, I want to remind everybody that today's discussion is on the record. We're streaming live, and you can join the conversation on Twitter at AC Global Energy, and don't forget to hashtag AC Energy. So we look forward to the panel's remarks and responses to your questions. And Sherry, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Morningstar. It's a pleasure to see so many good friends and colleagues today. Just delight to have you all here. I see many leaders from the defense energy space in the room, and it's just exciting to have everyone here for this session, Unleashing from the Tether of Fuel, Innovation at the Nexus of Advanced Energy and National Security. And as Ambassador Morningstar mentioned, I'm a board director at the Atlantic Council, one of, I think, the most dynamic think tanks in Washington today, committing smart ideas into practice. And today's event brings together sort of three centers here at the Council: the Global Energy Center, which Ambassador Morningstar heads, the new Adrian Arst Resilience Center, and the Millennium Leadership Program. And I also want to thank NREL, Tom Morehouse, Nathan Associates, Sue Chodakowicz, and I want to thank Greg Duque, my partner here, for helping bring this together. Now, President Fred Kemp here at the Atlantic Council is fond of saying that we're at an inflection point in history, particularly with respect to American leadership. And in my view, we're also at an inflection point in America's transition to an advanced energy economy. And advances in energy technology are enabling us to provide energy in new and different ways, potentially reducing risks, improving energy resilience, and also managing critical infrastructure risks associated with new energy. And since our current Secretary of Defense, Marine Corps General Jim Mattis, foreshadowed the current era by calling for our forces in Iraq a decade ago to be unleashed from the tether of fuel, the U.S. military has become a leader in seeking energy innovation to power remote operations and as well as installation innovations as well. Advances in microgrid technology and energy storage promise not only to unleash military operations, but also to enable sustainable economic development in remote regions such as the Arctic. And over the last decade, both the U.S. military and civilian sectors have recognized the security and economic benefits of diversifying energy sources, reducing risk to transmission, and improving storage. Indeed, energy resilience has become a force multiplier. And today, we're privileged to have four speakers who are at the forefront of energy resilience practice in four dimensions. First, General Conway, former Marine Corps Commandant, who made energy a key focus of his tenure as Commandant to improve military operational effectiveness. Second, Dr. Griff Thompson at the State Department, who focuses on energy diplomacy as transformation to advanced energy economies. Dr. Brian Hannigan from NREL on advanced energy technology in our energy labs. And Jeff Stone, an entrepreneur in innovative energy solutions for military and civilian uses. So allow me to introduce each of our panelists, who will then come join me up here, speak for 5 to 7 minutes each, after which I will moderate a discussion, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. General Conway served as the 34th Commandant of the United States Marine Corps. He's an infantry officer. He was president of the Marine Corps University at Quantico. He's served as led one MEF, And I had the privilege of working with him both when he was commandant, and I saw firsthand the leadership that he brought to the Marine Corps and throughout the Department of Defense, and particularly his personal efforts to engage the entire Corps and across the Department of Defense on energy innovation to improve military operational effectiveness. I've also had the privilege of working with him as a member of the CNA Military Advisory Board. I see some of our other distinguished members here, Admiral Gunn, Leo Goff, Ron Philadelphia, and if I've missed anyone else here in the room, but it's been a privilege to serve with all of you. So General Conway will be our first speaker. Second, we'll hear from Dr. Griff Thompson at the State Department, who's responsible for getting the Bureau's work on energy transformation, leveraging U.S. leadership in clean energy innovation to open markets for U.S. companies abroad and promoting market-based policies. He's got a very interesting career. He's worked at USAID, he's worked at State, and he's worked at NREL. And he's got a PhD from Georgetown University. I'm very excited to have Dr. Thompson with us today. And Dr. Brian Hannigan at NREL has been leading at that lab in a variety of energy areas, from fossil to renewables to science and technology. He's also worked at EPRI. He worked in the George W. Bush administration on the Council on Environmental Quality and the National Economic Council, and he's worked on the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. So he really brings a great diversity of experience to his portfolio. And last but certainly not least, we will be joined by Jeff Stone, who is a businessman and investor with experience in electric utilities, renewable energy, and grid security solutions. He's a member of the Business Executives for National Security, and he's worked with them on their work on looking at energy and microgrids for DoD installation energy security. May I ask, gentlemen, for you to join me, and General Conway, for you to come and offer your remarks.
Well, thanks, Sherry, for that nice introduction. My mother would be very pleased with the introduction. My mother-in-law would still be skeptical, but that's another story. Folks, great to be with you this afternoon. It was J.F.C. Fuller, I think, who first said that generals always fight the last war. But I'd like to add a little texture and context to that. You know, the generals that fought our last war are now retired, some of them dead. The people who will be the generals are the lieutenant colonels and the majors and the captains who have been promoted forward and now are in a position to make decisions. And I'll say right up front, I have some concerns that we, in retrospect, may have taught some of these young people some very bad lessons in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Strategically, we had them employ what I would call a Fort Apache strategy, where we went off into bad guy country, built our little forts, if you will, analogous to what we did in the 1860s and 70s in this country, hoping that the bad guys would run away and hide. Well, that didn't happen in the American West, and it didn't happen in Iraq or in Afghanistan either. What we did basically was to lose the initiative and cause ourselves to react. Operationally, in Afghanistan, and this is pertinent to our discussion today, we taught these young officers that it was okay to abuse our available energy systems. And just a little more on that. Here's the rub. You know, previously in theater, the further you went to the rear, the higher the quality of life, okay, and the more comfortable you became. And we were okay with that because if you're out there on the leading edge and you've got that pilot circling above with a 2,000-pound bomb, you hope that he had a good night's sleep the night before. So we don't have a problem with that. But in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were no rear areas. So everybody lived large and placed huge demands on the available energy system. Now, traditionally and historically, a soldier or a Marine carried the essentials that he needed in his pack. The hierarchy of needs were water, food, ammunition, shelter. You could add to that today, fuel for the vehicles probably, and batteries for the communication set. If you wanted to look at that airfield, you would add a runway, planes, parts, tools, and mechanics, and you could operate your expeditionary strip. However, again, in Iraq and Afghanistan, that all changed, okay? The shelter turned into a plywood sea hut. And by the way, we need gravel on the roadways because we don't like dust in our sea huts. It needed air conditioning, computer hookups, and a recreation tent next door. Sleeping bags evolved to cots, which evolved to metal frame beds with mattresses. And by the way, that water from the water buffalo had a chemical taste to it. So we much preferred the millions and millions of bottles of water that came in all the way across Pakistan. Didn't taste very good, by the way. After it sat in the sun, it tasted plastic. But nevertheless, you know, our canteens are empty, but our pockets were full of the water bottles. Platoon commanders demanded, my guys are working hard, they need 3 hot meals a day. And by the way, Haagen-Dazs for dessert is never bad, so we'll take that. And I don't want my people serving mess duty, so we need some of the KBR, third country nationals out there serving the chow. But if we get them, we'll need more sea huts. Okay, so you get the idea of how we sort of became what we did. And so, my friends, my first point to you today is that the American way of war has become somewhat bloated in my mind. And if we are to repeat that in the future, then we do so with a certain level of risk. The Chinese intelligence officers describe the American way of war as technologically advanced with integrated use of satellites, long-range comms, and precision strike weapons. I think they'd be far less impressed if they look at how we actually do business on the ground. Perhaps a CENTCOM directive in 2009 at the time of the Afghan surge signaled the depth of our decline when it said, and this is a quote, I still have the message, "The combat forces cannot be deployed until the infrastructure is completed." Think about that for a moment. I assured them at the time, I was commandant, that, you know, our Marines don't need your infrastructure. But I'll tell you, ladies and gentlemen, it was a full 6 months before all of those surge forces made it into Afghanistan. And that brings up the second point, that is that the U.S. military must develop an expeditionary mentality towards its deployments and its operations. And again, that relates to our topic of energy today. The success of the U.S. military is normally associated with the ability to shoot, move, and communicate with the idea of closing on and destroying your enemy. The record shows that our prolonged stays have not gone as well, and short of disaster relief, that nation building should normally be left to the other elements of U.S. power. Our role should be to go in hard, whatever the weight of your force, maintain a momentum in the initiative, and get the job done just before you get out. That segues into my final and third and most important point, I think, and that is that advanced energy technologies can and must play a central role in the efficiency of the U.S. military. We realized somewhat late in the game, I would say probably around 2008, I was commandant from 06 to 10, but in about 2008, we slapped the table and said something has to change, because what we found was that our casualties in our resupply convoys were exceeding those of our troops in the field. The enemy had patterned us. We had become static. We were predictable. And he found those linear convoys a fairly easy target compared to the guys that he had to face again in the field. We had previously established an expeditionary warfare center, but we also, as a subset of that, created an expeditionary energy office and put a hotshot colonel in charge. His first task was to go into theater and take a look at what was happening there and see if we couldn't approach the problem from perhaps a different vector. That task force that went in was horrified with what they found. In one instance, there was a combat operations center that had 3 generators running 24/7, each pulling about 30% of the load. They found that we had combat outposts sitting astride fresh water canals where the locals got their drinking water, but we were trucking in, again, thousands of water bottles a week, okay, through these convoys to this particular combat outpost. Our supply discipline was terrible. The people back at the main base said, hey, if the lieutenant orders it, he must need it badly, so we're going to, by God, get it to him. And that was, it's a good mentality on the one hand. It's a very precarious mentality, of course, on the other. I was compelled when they got back to send out what we call a white letter to my commanders, lieutenant colonels and above. And I said, hey, I want your organization to have an energy officer that takes a look at wastage on your bases and stations, that takes a look at the requirements that your troops are laying down out there, that takes a look at the fact that each convoy that goes outside the wire will be delivering essential supplies, not nice-to-have supplies. And by the way, that energy officer is you, because this is serious business. We're losing Marines because of some of the very bad practices that we had allowed to take root. At about the same time back in the States, we made a call to industry and said, help us here, gang. We're going to show you what the focus areas are. We're going to bring you together, and we want you to show us what you can do. We're all from Missouri. Let's start with that, and you show us just what you can do. An 80% solution is okay. We'll test it here. If it looks like it's got promise, we will send it into theater and let them do the product improvement there. And I think the key ingredient was that we showed them the balance on our bank account, and they knew we were serious, and they came to us in large numbers. There were some promising ideas. One gent said, this is my machine. You put it on the back of a 20-foot flatbed, drive it up next to a farmer's field where he has stalks. It can be corn, it could be poppies, it could be any kind of food crop, if you will. You put those stalks and chemicals and liquids into my machine, and you get fuel that comes out on the other side. Now, he said, we wouldn't recommend you fly your helicopters with it, but we certainly think that you can run your Hummers and your trucks off of this fuel. We were pretty intrigued. Another gentleman came with a bolt of material, about 3/16 of an inch thick, and he said, this is insulation for your tents. Now, anybody that's tried to do it knows that the most difficult thing in the world is to warm a tent in the cold or heat a tent heat a tent in the cold or warm a tent in the, make a tent cool when it's hot or heat a tent when it's cold, all right? But this guy promises an increase in our R factor by about 10. And so again, we were really intrigued by this. And by the way, the inside was white, and we would get refractive light and that type of thing in the wee hours. So we were really encouraged. Another guy came and said, this is a self-contained geothermal device for your tents. You have an 8-inch pipe up here with a fan in it that goes into the top of the tent, drapes down the side, goes underneath. A 6-inch pipe comes out the other side into the other side of the tent, and it dumps cold air. And it's not going to be frigid air, but it's going to be enough for your computers to operate 24 hours a day. We were excited by that. The problem is, ladies and gentlemen, none of these things worked, okay? We had them all laid out. I mean, they gave some semblance of what had been offered, but the bottom line is none of them worked. Another lady came to us, and she was from a nuclear company, and she had a device that was about the size of a casket. And she said, you take this in the country, you shield it, you bury it, you run the cables out of the ground, and you can power an air base for an indefinite period of time. We kind of laughed nervously during her presentation. I think most of us could see Carr's eye going apoplectic, okay, and arguing that we were going to make Afghanistan glow on the satellite pictures. So we thanked her and said, we're probably not ready for this. But in retrospect, you know, fortune favors the bold, and maybe we ought to go see that lady today because with this microgrid discussion, there certainly could be potential there. Indeed, most of our successes, though, came from non-material types of solutions. We put qualified electrical engineers into the wiring harnesses at our bases and gleaned much more efficiency from what we already had laid down. We broke the water purification systems out of this spare equipment lot and put them out where they were supposed to be. And they started making good quantifiable water that the corpsmen tested, and our troops actually found in some cases better than the plastic bottles. Our commanders started paying attention. and much fewer convoys left the wire to go out to those people on the leading edge. We did find that there was a roll-up solar panel that our radio operators loved because they could put that into their pack, break it out, and save having to carry the batteries. And it quite efficiently ran our radios. We also began developing about that same time what we call the K-MAX helicopter, which was a remotely controlled transport helicopter that could sling load 1,000 to 1,200 pounds and just do milk runs all day from one location to another, not endangering our Marines. So where are we today, folks? You know, my belief is that we are in a 100-year war with Islamic extremism. I think that Western society will be able to do little to fix the problem, but I think that the Muslim nations now realize they've got an issue, and it's probably going to take a generation or two to get away from the madrasas, to change the sermons on Friday and that manner of thing, to root some of these undesirables out. That's not to say that there will not be conflict in what we term ungoverned spaces. Spaces where the environment is harsh, therefore there are not many people there. Government security forces don't often even go there if they exist. And those are the types of places that sort of beckon to the terrorists. So we think that, you know, we're going to be in some of those places in the future, and you may read about it, you may not. But the fact is, those are the very types of spaces that may maximize our capacity to achieve advanced energy. And so there is perhaps a positive that comes out of all of that. In the last couple of years, the DOD Energy Office has shut down. The Army Rapid Acquisition Office now has lead on developments and fresh technology. Talking to some of those folks, the subject matter experts would tell us that the most disruptive technologies they see on the horizons, the one they're most excited about, are potentially fuel cell technology and energy storage. We still haven't reached our zenith on those two things, so they really are pursuing those with the gusto. And perhaps most importantly, and Jim's name was referenced a little bit ago, we now have a new Secretary of Defense who understands both the challenges but the opportunities associated with what it is that we need to do. Now, if you're a vendor out there today and you're looking, okay, so what are the parameters? What do I have to do to sort of, you know, broach the DOD lineup here? I'd offer you a few thoughts. Your project needs to be a significant enhancement over legacy systems. If you're going to say, I'm going to offer you a 1 or 2% improvement, and you line it on the out years, you try to make it look attractive, it's not enough. It needs to be a significant enhancement over what we're doing now to get you to first base. It needs to integrate with the existing equipment set. If you tell us you're going to glean another 4 miles per hour on our vehicles, but we got to change out all the engines in our Hummers and trucks in order to be able to get there and put a new one, it's not going to happen, okay? That investment is just too great at a time when the department doesn't have that kind of money. Needs to be worldwide deployable. Someone mentioned the Arctic earlier. Let's not fight the last war and say we're always going to be in the high desert, okay? It needs to be able to work in the Arctic as well as in the high desert. It needs to work in the rainforest because we don't know where we're going to go or where the military may be called to serve. Needs to be lightweight, simple to operate, and ruggedized is the term. I say marine-proof, okay, because I guarantee you at some point in its life cycle, your piece of kit is going to be thrown onto the back of a 5-ton, and at the other end, it's going to be thrown to the ground, okay, as you offload. And you're going to have to be able to get it up, dust it off, and it still has to work. So it needs to be a rugged piece of kit. And last but certainly not least, it needs to be affordable. The department does not have a lot of money these days. I realize you've got to have a margin that you can live with and be profitable, but it needs to be something that we can afford to do. Finally, Alexander once said, "My logisticians are a humorless lot. That is because they know if the campaign fails, I will slay them first." Ladies and gentlemen, the logisticians don't have to die, okay? American ingenuity, focused in the right direction and properly resourced, can maintain and I would argue even expand our dominance in the field of advanced energy. I wish the Atlantic Council much success in making it so. Thank you.
Excellent.
Well, thank you very much. I first of all want to thank Ambassador Morningstar and Sherry Goodman for inviting the State Department to come over and talk about a topic that is perfectly suited for what we do in the Energy Bureau at the State Department, what we have been doing for the last 5 years, and what we will continue to do in the foreseeable future. And listen, it's always nice to be associated with a Marine. I gained a newfound appreciation of that in the summer of 2015 when I was asked by our ambassador to come out to Baghdad twice in the span of 6 weeks in the middle of a heat wave to talk with the Office of the Prime Minister and the Electricity Minister on how we could start getting some juice flowing to run air conditioning. And I quickly learned in Baghdad in the compound that one's comfort level grew in proportion to one's proximity to a Marine. So it's nice to be sitting next to General Conway today. And I think everybody in the room appreciates very thoroughly that we're in the middle of a historic energy transformation. Country after country, city after city, company after company is moving to integrate renewable energy into their energy mix. And they all do that for a variety of reasons: increased economic prosperity, domestic security, regional security, job creation, et cetera, et cetera. But what I want to talk a little bit about today, in the limited time that I have, is why the State Department is so involved. And in doing so, I want to redefine the terms of discourse. I want to expand the way in which we view energy, the way we view energy diplomacy. And so we can quickly come to see how obvious it is that State Department is sitting here with the private sector, with the world's leading laboratory in renewable energy, and a representative of the military. Again, we're in a historic energy transformation. And because of the multiple reasons of why people are doing it, I think calls out the very fundamental fact of the centrality of energy. The centrality of energy to everything we do. The provision of energy services is the antecedent condition for everything on the development agenda and increasingly everything on the diplomatic agenda. And as General Conway just pointed out, it is certainly central to our military affairs and activities at home and overseas. It's very clear from both the commercial side and the diplomatic side. Poor people make poor customers. Poor people without electricity foment violence and destabilize governments. And so what we do at the State Department is respond to country after country around the world who are realizing the importance and, in fact, the necessity of integrating renewable energy into their energy mix. Energy portfolio diversification leads to greater economic prosperity and greater domestic, regional, and international security. And we do this in a number of different ways. And countries come to us simply because of America's leadership on this transition. They come to us because they've seen how the United States has transformed our domestic markets to increase the adoption of renewable energy and energy efficiency, and they want to know how to do it. We started out a couple of years ago with a bilateral task force, the Clean Energy Finance Task Force between us and India. Prime Minister Modi had established a very, very ambitious goal of 175 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2022. When he met with our president, we realized that you needed an expansive influx of private capital. And one way to do that, in fact, the only way to do that, is to change your institutions. Reform the policy and regulatory structures, the institutional scaffolding that'll accelerate this transition by facilitating and encouraging private sector capital into your country. We had demonstrated that in the United States, and so for the last 2 years, we've been working with the public sector and the private sector in India on how they can change the institutional structures, what policies and regulatory innovations they can adopt, what kind of financial instruments they can use to foment domestic and international private capital. Since then, we've moved on to a couple other countries. Israel came to us last year. I spent several months going back and forth between Tel Aviv and Washington to negotiate a bilateral dialogue that resulted in a Clean Energy Finance Task Force. Again, Israel is world known as a startup nation in water, in IT, but they seemed a little bit frustrated that they weren't the startup nation in renewable energy. They wanted to work with us as they wanted to increase the share of renewable energy into their domestic portfolio. We have since had 3 meetings of the task force, and we'll soon have our fourth. At the same time, I started negotiations with the Palestinian Authority to look at how can we help them as they receive and start to implement this newfound authority in the agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority in September of last year, giving the Palestinian Authority responsibility for their electricity system in the Palestinian territories. Both countries have asked the United States, through these dialogues, to serve as an interface, if you will, between the two countries. So we're using these energy dialogues as something much more expansive than simply the provision of electrons. We are using these dialogues as a way for constructive engagement for political, economic, and social development. And so what I find is that electrons can be as important as elections in fomenting democratic discourse and encouraging public discourse and civic relations. We in the renewable energy and the energy field writ large for years have undervalued and underestimated the thematic opulence of energy and the magnitude of the possibilities diplomatically and politically of using energy as a tool not only for increased services of energy, but for economic, social, and political development. And so that's what we do in my pillar of the energy transformation, is look at energy service provision not only to fuel the lights and refrigerate the health clinics and get instant access to the internet, but how can we use the discussions and the discourse? How can we get people to act in manners that addresses the fundamentals of politics, who gets what, where, how, and not, why? Aristotle told us that politics is a practical, not a speculative science. We become political men and women by doing political things. And there's few things more political than deciding as a community how one maintains and achieves one's energy services. So we look at energy from a very expansive sense. And that if we use energy as a tool, as a mechanism by address the multiple dimensions of our foreign policy objectives, from the military to R&D to commercial expansion to domestic security and regional security, I think we'll be much more successful in not only these other goals of democratization and governance, but also at kickstarting economic growth, economic development, social development, job creation, both at home and abroad. So again, what we do at the State Department is look at and work with countries who want to pursue the energy transformation to increase their domestic resilience. And so we do, words are fine, but watts are better. And what we do is translate the paragraphs on an MOU into projects on the ground. And for that reason, we work closely with NREL. In fact, we had one of Brian's colleagues in our offices early this morning talking about how NREL and the State Department can collaborate on a number of international issues. There isn't a week that goes by that we don't speak with the private sector. And of course, with the military, we spent some time with former Assistant Secretary Ballantyne on working with the Air Force as they wanted to pursue a solar system within their facilities within the UAE. So again, I compliments to Ambassador Morningstar and Sherry Goodman for putting together the multiple dimensions here and the sectors that are required to keep America in the leadership role in this energy transformation that is sweeping the globe. Thank you very much.
Nice job, sir.
So I too want to thank the ambassador and Sherry for putting together this excellent panel, which I'm honored to be a part of. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory is one of 17 national laboratories operated by the Department of Energy. And secretaries from Schlesinger to Perry and the presidents that they have served have long recognized that the national laboratories are actually national treasures. They are the source of a wide variety of innovations in foundational science and technology, from materials and chemistry to power electronics to new consumer devices, including the vehicles that we're seeing increasingly driven on the nation's roads. So it makes a lot of sense that when we look to solve societal problems, either on the battlefield or through diplomacy or through the market of innovation. We look to those national laboratories and their private sector partners, as well as our academic and university partners, to help create a rich foundation that can be drawn upon to solve these issues. Nowhere is this more obvious, in my view, than in the field of advanced energy. And as you can see on the chart over there, the progress that we've been making even over the last decade, let alone the decades previous, has been remarkable. The chart here shows the costs in the bar charts for 3 advanced energy technologies: distributed solar photovoltaics, PV, LED lighting, and electric vehicle batteries, as indicative of what we see created in innovations in storage. And you can see the trends on all the bars are steadily downward. Those costs are improving. We're scaling up production. And as a result, the orange lines that show the total capacity or the deployment are growing at a rate that would make most business leaders envious. These ingredients of an advanced energy system are multiplying by the day, and that allows us to think about ways in which we change the operations of our nation's electric grid, both locally as well as at a national level. Here, the 17 national laboratories are working together in something called the Grid Modernization Laboratory Consortium, because while we're strong individually, we're stronger together as a group, leveraging our relevant strengths and distinctive capabilities to throw our collective efforts into this national challenge of how to integrate these technologies that are emerging into the existing infrastructure, something the General so rightly pointed out as a must-have for their activity. And I would argue it's no different for the mayor of a city or the operator of a utility. Those new technologies have to be compatible with what we have going on today. The nature of these emerging technologies, the fact that they're drawing their resources increasingly from wind and solar energy supplies, which are by definition more variable and less under our control. I started my career as a meteorologist, and even I'll admit I can't control the weather. So we have to begin to operate our grids in a way that allows for that uncertainty and that variability of the energy supply, both on the left side at the utility scale with respect to the generation, but increasingly also on the right side of this diagram, where consumers are generating electricity on their huts, in their tents, in their villages, in their communities, and on their rooftops. That consumer is both consuming and producing energy, hence the term prosumer that you're hearing increasingly discussed. Our nation's electric grid was built with a really solid architecture in mind for the time. Large central generation, one-way distribution down a fixed wire system from high to low voltage to a passive customer on the other end. But that architecture is giving way to something that you can see is more dynamic, more distributed, and much more decentralized. And so the challenge that we face, and the one that our Grid Modernization Consortium is taking on as part of a larger DOE Grid Modernization Initiative, is how to create the architecture for the new century that awaits us. With all of these advanced energy technologies, how do we bring in the new with the old, keep the lights on, keep the costs low, increasingly become more sustainable and more resilient and secure along the way? There are 6 key areas where we've focused our efforts with over 100 different projects involving private sector and utility partners. These projects fall into one of these 6 categories, which I'll summarize briefly. The first is how the new devices, the new advanced energy technologies are individually as well as collectively in groups like microgrids able to provide new and different services to the grid, and in turn what the grid must do to allow those devices to maximize their use. So we have to study devices and integrated systems in a variety of combinations and use cases. We also need to sense and measure the grid more appropriately, because if we know what the grid needs next hour when the wind turbines stop turning or the sun goes away behind a cloud, if we understand what that means for the state of the grid, then we can take compensatory actions with our diesel gensets or our battery storage and adjust to keep the grid resilient and providing the services that we need. So sensors and measurements can tell us what we need to ask of those devices in the first element. If we have more visibility into our grid, we can control it more in real time and more dynamically so that we don't have to carry 20% extra generator or 20% extra battery around with us everywhere that we go and pay for that when it's sitting there underutilized. We can also plan and design for this brave new world where maybe we're thinking about not building a generator to serve the peak load, but instead managing those peak loads in such a way that we don't need that new generator anymore. If my solar PV on my rooftop is generating power I can't use on the plug, maybe that's the time where I go and get the gray water recycling unit to sit in my garage that operates only when there's extra PV, meaning I'm not paying any more for the energy to power that, but I've now got a new service. I've got clean water that replaces the millions of those bottles that are being carted around in the field. We have to focus on building the system inherently for the new security and resilience challenges that are coming our way, not only in terms of the critical infrastructure, but also the fact that these are now increasingly networked and meshed together, and that entry points exist in multiple locations and multiple domains. Conversely, we're now interdependent in a good way such that if any one of those devices goes down, I have 99,000 other ones to draw my services from, provided I can isolate them from whatever disturbance, be it natural or human-induced, caused that one loss of equipment in one location. So there's resilience in security through diversity of supply of the things that we need. And then finally, you got to make a buck. So we need the markets, we need the regulations, we need the business models to take us from thinking about energy as a commodity, a kilowatt hour, a gallon, a BTU to be consumed, and thinking about energy more as a service, a thing that keeps us comfortable, a thing that keeps us healthy with fresh water, allows us to go from point A to point B. How do we stand back and look at the consumer and ask ourselves, how do we allow energy to be the means to the end for what that consumer wants? When you do that, you get some very interesting new markets, new designs, new business models, new innovations, which will only further spur the development of these advanced energy technologies going forward. I'll close with one example which has both military and civilian applications that we're working at NREL. The challenge was provided to us by the Army's Rapid Equipping Force and now has migrated through into other organizations to help them minimize the use of diesel in the field in locations that were somewhat sunny. The idea was to deploy in a scalable form factor similar to what's being transported today in the diesel TQGs, the tactical quiet generators. Could we develop solar PV arrays that would sit alongside those and help offset some of the diesel use to reduce the convoy and supply line risk? Well, to do that, you need a grid microcontroller, kind of like the orchestra conductor that shifts between the diesel and the sun and the battery and the loads and all of the other devices. And so working together with the Army, we created that cube, controllable utility-based energy system that you see here, which is basically a microgrid in a box, designed to meet the specific need of a forward operating base, but it could also be used for disaster restoration and recovery. If you can imagine a first responder getting these on a National Guard C-130 and having with it communications and water purification and cell phone recharge and a variety of other services that are in short supply, why wouldn't that also be useful at home as well as abroad? And so these technologies that we're developing through the lab consortium, through the lab partnerships, I think offer a vista into the world of a future advanced energy system that achieves a lot of the objectives, if not all, that the General and Griff have talked about. And by the way, the labs are not working alone. We're working with partners across the private sector and the university spectrum. And in my view, we can't have enough of this soon enough. So let's get to work. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for inviting me. I'd like to start out by observing that how we view the nexus of advanced energy and national security has changed dramatically over time. In the 70s, the connection was expressed almost solely in terms of ensuring America was self-sufficient in its fossil fuel supplies. It took a while, but we've pretty much solved that problem, although we may have created worse ones. Today, of course, the frame of reference is much wider, running from ways to make military bases resilient in the face of natural disasters and cyber threats to the overarching one of minimizing the global effects of climate change and the conflicts and migration it can cause. I think it's a fair question to ask whether there's any practical way to ramp up renewable energy at a pace and scale sufficient to arrest the dangerous trajectory of carbon already in the air. I don't know the answer. Being a former securities analyst, I do feel comfortable in saying that a sound fundamental analysis of the power generation industry in this country shows that in the long term, coal can't compete with gas or renewables, even on an unsubsidized basis and regardless of any changes that might be made to environmental regulations here. Even so, the political headwinds facing nuclear energy are very strong, and natural gas is almost certain to remain abundant and cheap for years to come, not only pressuring coal, but also raising the bar for renewables. I'd also make the point today that the term innovation in the title of our program shouldn't be narrowly defined. The best new technologies won't move the national security needle unless they're deployed broadly, and for that to happen, we'll need to rely heavily on the private sector to find ways to make advanced energy technology affordable, reliable, and profitable. So when I refer to innovation, please understand that it includes businesses' translational skills, things like logistical efficiency, scalability, systems integration, and financing. I've been involved as a businessman with some interesting power generation companies over the last 22 years. None of them has ever invented a brand new energy technology, but all of them have been very good at bringing advanced energy solutions to market. When I started in 1995 in this industry, I invested in a small company that owned a fleet of compact diesel generators, which it used to make on-site electricity for touring rock and roll performers playing at very large stadium complexes. The company's founders were two very sharp ex-roadies, trained as electricians, who saw an unmet need and devised a way to meet it using what was then the best available energy technology. The company's key innovation was the speed of deployment. The energy technology was off the shelf, but the logistics system was completely new. Everything the company bought or built was designed to transport easily, move quickly, snap together, and form a grid. We took the grids on the road and installed them several times each week in different cities all around the world. The company ultimately expanded to serve other related markets, and because it did, it was acquired by a much larger, diversified company. I'll skip ahead and tell you that the same management team and investment team started an energy services venture with far greater ambitions and potential. That company installs and operates fast-track, utility-scale, temporary power plants in developing countries. The plants typically range in size from 50 megawatts to 200 megawatts. The customers generally are state-owned utilities. The plants take less than 90 days to install. The preferred technology is trailer-mounted modular gas turbine generators. Simple cycle, not combined cycle. It's a BYOF operation. Customers buy their own fuel, but the company operates and maintains the machines. Contracts normally run for a year or 2 or 3, after which the company removes the machines for use somewhere else. The business innovations here are speed, scale, and the first use of best available technology, as well as commercial flexibility. The business model of short-term power supply contracts doesn't lock the customer into a single technology. The key business risk, of course, is customer non-payment, and I'll get back to that later. I also have some recent on-the-ground experience with lower carbon generation systems through an investment I made 2 years ago in a startup hybrid generator manufacturer based in Ireland. So far, the company has sold about 2,000 of these, primarily to cell tower operators in Africa, and they look a lot like the units up there. Our hybrid generators have 4 components: a lithium-ion battery pack, a small PV array, a small diesel engine, and a smart electronic controller, which decides which energy source operates at any given time. I would put hybrids squarely in the category of an advanced energy technology because they really are, as Brian said, a microgrid in a box. The main attraction is that hybrids use up to 75% diesel than conventional diesel generators. The main advantage of our hybrids is that they really work, even in very, very abusive operating environments. Our company buys all of its components from OEMs, so it's really a play on systems integration, another kind of innovation. The hybrids for cell towers, and that's who we sell them to, are only 12 kilowatts to 25 kilowatts in output, but the technology can scale up to almost any capacity, making them a great solution for all sorts of applications in developing countries, including rural electrification. This could be a really large market for hybrid technology, and one I'm personally keen to pursue. Now, I want to turn briefly to what I know about our military's experience with advanced installation energy. About 4 years ago, then Assistant Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter asked a group I belong to, BENS, Business Executive for National Securities, take a close look at the feasibility of microgrids at military bases here in the United States. I'm glad to see that Dorothy Robine's here today. Dorothy Robine was our primary point of contact and a real thought leader, and very, very helpful to us during the entire process. So then, as now, the military was rethinking energy, both in the context of making warfighters more mobile and lethal, and installations greener and more resilient in the event of natural disasters or malicious events directed at the grid. The report we wrote was a long one, but one of its key findings was that a one-size-fits-all solution does not exist. I'm encouraged to see how a number of installations around the country have moved ahead in intelligent ways, integrating a variety of conventional and advanced energy technologies to improve efficiency and operational sustainability. Brian Hannigan had a lot to say about this as well. So let me end by talking about an area of innovation at the nexus of advanced energy and national security that I believe is the weakest link now. And that area is financing, money. Here in the United States, money isn't much of an impediment to renewables and other advanced energy investments. Large-scale solar and wind projects, even transmission projects, tap into a variety of readily available financial sources. Tax credits are generous. Capital is available because counterparty risk is low. That is, equity investors and lenders have a high degree of confidence that utilities will pay for the energy they agree to buy. But the story is far different when you talk about capital for advanced energy projects in developing countries. Money for these is scarce because counterparty risk is high. Government-owned utilities have weak balance sheets often. The problem is particularly acute for the kinds of energy services projects I'm most familiar with, which don't involve the one-time sale of a finished good or machine, but are instead characterized by the installation of equipment, the dedication of operating personnel, and payments over an extended period of time. Even companies backed by deep-pocketed institutional investors are reluctant to put capital at risk in these kinds of investments in these kinds of places. If we believe advanced energy projects outside our borders add value to our national security, we should want to solve the financing problem. Electricity is a well-known economic multiplier. It enables higher living standards and tends to promote political stability. No one can say for sure whether a new geothermal plant in a Central American country will directly reduce gang violence or trafficking or relieve migration pressures. But it will at least lower average energy costs and cut carbon emissions, and it may do all of the above. No one can say that a rural electrification project using hybrids in a Central African country will directly reduce the tendency of young men and women to join ISIS, but it will support economic growth and reduce the likelihood that more carbon-intensive energy plants will get built there instead. So if we believe there is a cause and effect between advanced energy and national security, even if it can't be precisely quantified, the government and the national security community should step up. In the area of public-private partnerships, I can think of several things that would work. One, extending renewable energy investment tax credits to U.S.-built projects in places like Central America and Africa. Two, making working capital lines and receivables guarantees available to U.S. companies who provide ongoing services and are reliant on installment payments for electricity under power purchase agreements in developing countries. Three, allowing U.S. government entities to buy the carbon offsets created when U.S. companies construct and operate advanced energy projects in strategically important places. Now, I don't mean to imply at all that the state and commerce departments aren't already quite willing to assist U.S. companies attempting to bring advanced energy systems to developing countries. They are. My point is that their advocacy, while much appreciated and often helpful, doesn't solve the key structural issue that prevents deployment at scale.
Well, great. I think you can. We all appreciate how deep and rich this discussion has already been from our panelists, and I want to get in just a minute or two to questions from the and conversation with the audience. But let me start by asking a question for each of our panelists. And General Conway, if Secretary Mattis asked your advice on what should be his top priority in continuing his efforts and unleashing from the tether of fuel, what's your principal advice to him?
Okay. Let me start out by saying, explaining, Sherry, as I think I once did to you, what Jim meant about unleashing from fuel. When you've got, in his case, 1st Marine Division, 500 to 1,000 vehicles, okay, that all burn fuel. Either you have fuel or they don't run, and he knew that, of course, as he drove on Baghdad. What he was talking about when he made this, created this term, he was talking to his troops. They were carrying siphoning hoses, and they were determined to take advantage of Iraqi fuel depots and even Iraqi military vehicles and civilian vehicles if they were abandoned, in order to be able to fuel his vehicles. So he understands, of course, the absolute utility in this day and age of having fuel, but a fairly innovative way to keep momentum, sort of mitigate what our line of supply problems might be. The Marine Corps wasn't built to go 500 miles in an attack, and he realized that, and so that was essentially his essence in the comment. But I think there needs to be diversification, and that would be the thing I would say to Jim, is if I realize, what our automotive companies are going to offer when you put out an RFP, it's probably going to be internal combustion types of things. But in this country today, our transportation sector, the things that greases our economy and runs our industry, is 92% reliant on fuel. Petroleum fuel. And to the degree that we can diversify that and in some ways have the military sort of take a lead, I would certainly foray in that direction to sample the cost, sample the technology, see what the possibilities are. And I suppose that's this interest in the Army acquisition program on the fuel cells. But to the degree that you've got different means of achieving the same thing, that is fueling your vehicles, I think that could be beneficial to us in the long term.
Thank you. Griff, when Secretary Tillerson asked for your top energy transformation priorities, what will you advise him?
Good question, Sherry. Listen, the Secretary certainly knows energy markets. There's probably nobody in this town that knows energy markets more than he does. And all I can say is what we have said in our transition papers, what we have said publicly, and what I've said here, is that what we need to do is to help the countries around the world move to change the institutions. To address Jeff's point, it's all about finance. But there's no amount of public sector subsidies, tax incentives, or whatever that'll accelerate the types of movement we need to affect this energy transformation. It starts in the host countries, fixing the policy and regulatory structures. As one of the leading banks, the environmental director of one of the leading banks in the world keeps telling me, he says, Griff, fix the institutions and the money will find you. So that's what we do. We sit down with countries and say, if you want to transform the energy sector, in your country, you fix the institutions, and not just focus on the energy ministry. Bring in the finance ministry, the labor ministry, the health ministry. The successes of all the other ministries are dependent upon the provision of clean energy services for job creation and domestic security. So our priority in the Energy Bureau is looking at how we can work with our allies around the world, as well as multilateral organizations, to effect this change through market transformation, transparency, and basic market rules that have worked in country after country after country.
Great. Brian, when Secretary Perry asks you about, well, you know, with all these increases in defense, but not in the energy budget, why should we continue our collaboration with the military? Shouldn't we just unleash them on their own? How are you going to respond?
So I was thinking you might continue the theme on what Secretary Perry would ask me is the most important investment.
You can ask that. You can answer that question too.
So each customer segment, whether it's the military, whether it's industry, whether it's a city or a community, has needs for energy services that are specific to them. And the risk that we run if we entirely turn this over to the DoD and let them lead the way on innovation is they're going to innovate for their mission need. And without a partner to work with through the Department of Energy, through cities and local governments, there's no way to guarantee that that innovation also serves the civilian purpose. And so for that reason, you need a partnership across both of the agencies and bring in others like transportation as well that are part of the energy system, as the general was saying a moment ago.
Great. And Jeff, you had a lot of very interesting ideas in your remarks about financing, how to fix financing. When Secretary Ross calls you in and says, Jeff, help me, what's your advice?
Well, years ago, I sat across the table from Secretary Ross, and he is a truly intelligent but very intimidating fellow. So I think, again, you know, being involved in the things that I'm involved in, you know, this notion of public-private partnership has always been a curious sort of concept to me. But like I said, I think I don't think we're looking for funding for demonstration projects. I think we're frankly looking for ways to establish proven advanced energy solutions in countries, and making sure that a beachhead, you know, is established pretty firmly. And that's why, you know, I make suggestions like providing U.S. companies that do things in other countries to get the same tax credits as they do for the same sorts of activities here. You know, I build a plant in Peru. I'm not going to pay Peruvian taxes. It's a flow-through entity, and I'm going to structure it so that my tax liabilities here in the United States. So being able to recover those tax credits means that, in the form of a check from the Department of Energy, means that my equity is recovered very, very quickly, and I feel a lot better about things. I can recycle that equity into a second and a third and a fourth plant. Same thing if I could get, you know, God forbid, the Navy to buy carbon credits from me, right, for a geothermal plant in, you know, you name the country, Honduras. That would be great, because I can leverage that as additional equity, get myself off the ground and put a, you know, a profitable, proven plant in the works very quickly. So that's the kind of public-private partnership I'm looking for. If I were talking to Wilbur Ross, that's what I would say. He might say that's sensible, or he might not. I just don't know where his mind would be.
Okay, great. We're going to open the floor for questions. Please state your name and your affiliation. And okay, gentleman here in the front.
Ken Dillon, CNC Press. Cyber threats have become increasingly prominent, and I'm wondering in what ways can these advanced technologies and their various applications be shielded from cyber threats and perhaps protect the rest of the energy system from cyber threats?
One of the projects that we have underway in our grid modernization initiative is to improve the use of the sensed data and the data analytics that we're gathering from the increased deployment of smart meters and advanced metering and sensing infrastructure in the devices themselves to tell us more about what the grid should be under normal conditions. So that allows us to then detect the threats when whatever the data come back is in an off-normal or a non-normal mode of operation. If we can use the advancements in computational science, the advancements in data mining, machine learning, artificial intelligence to begin to detect those threats more quickly, then we can isolate where there is an attack. We can isolate that particular node of the network in such a way that the rest of the nodes in that network can then reassemble and keep the lights on and keep the function available to that place of that part of the grid that's not being subject to the attack. That sort of defense in depth concept applies to the grid as well as to our military operations. And so using the sensors, using the data, allowing the microgrid controllers to auto reconfigure based on what's available, just as an orchestra conductor would go with whatever musicians happen to show up that day for practice. Those kinds of concepts are now becoming de rigueur and part of our normal daily life, both in civilian as well as military applications.
I can't talk about what the department is doing specifically for a couple of reasons, but I can tell you that they're looking at it closely. And they recognize that this has nothing to do with forward deployed forces. This is about defense establishments in the United States. And the fact that they have done the analysis, had the war games, and they realize that our society breaks down on the 11th day. And if we can't communicate and goods can't flow and people can't be fed and you can't access water, it's a national calamity. So I would simply, hopefully, give you a level of comfort that the DoD is looking at their sector of it, along with Homeland Defense, realize it's a tremendous danger to our national survival and the developing means to combat it.
Gentleman here.
This is Otto Kreischer, Sea Power Magazine. This is for General Conway. You talked about, we had 15 years of fixed base operations against a relatively low-tech opponent. We're now facing the future where we may be up against a more peer competitor, and the concept has gone to distributed operations. Small units operating on their own, but they still have to be in touch with the rest of the world. How does what the DoD is doing on alternative or advanced energies, how does that fit into this concept of smaller units, distributed operations? Yeah. But they have to be more mobile, even more mobile than we did say in Vietnam.
Yeah, good seeing you again, Otto. You look well. It gets back to a little bit of what I talked about in that we have to appreciate that those dispersed units and the smaller units that are operating independently have to marginalize their demands. Okay, we may need to get back to the fact that everything you need has to be carried in your pack. In some ways, it's kind of a special operations mentality. But if you're going to be out there isolated and survive and accomplish your mission, you can't be tied to the comforts that you had back at your main base. So. And frankly, I think the troops are okay with that. We took a mission up in Talafar province out of Anbar to assist the army with rat lines into Syria. And these troops all came from Al-Assad Air Base, which was one of those forts I was talking to you about that had the 3 squares a day and a Haagen-Dazs. We were going to rotate the troops up to this fairly desolate, wind-swept, combat outpost. They didn't want to leave. Okay, they say, this is what we're here to do. This is real. That's Disneyland back there. And so I mention that to you only because I think the troops are okay with that. And they can be pretty self-sufficient. Believe me, they will create their own level of comfort in ways that won't be uniform. You won't like the looks of it, but it'll more than serve the purpose from the troops' perspective. So I think rugged individualism is going to come into play here and getting by on just the things that you have in your pack.
Gentleman here.
Thanks very much. I'm Philip Cornell. I'm a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council. My question is also for General Conway, and it was about interoperability. In much more traditional sort of energy sources, things like fuel standardization at the NATO level has gone a long way to be interoperable in allied or coalition operations. What do you see to be the challenges and that are associated with these new systems coming onto the battlefield in terms of affecting that? And do you think that there's sufficient energy being put towards that effort?
Well, I mean, it gets back to what you just said. The standardization, where America likes to work with partners and allies, okay? And I think that's a good thing, and we should continue to prosper that. And I think that we need to share the technology as rapidly as we can. We have some friends here from Netherlands today, okay? But I think especially NATO countries and those that might go with us to these, uninhabited spaces need to understand where we are, what we're developing, to the degree we can standardize those fittings and those tubes and all those types of things, and share. Leatherneck, for instance, was a joint U.S.-UK base. And there was great sharing and great camaraderie there, in fact, to get those things done. So it's an absolute necessity. I wouldn't change a bit of the vector that's out there now. I will continue to say keep doing it, and we'll be good for the long term. Good point, though.
And just on that, I'll add that interoperability is a huge concern on the civilian side, on the domestic front, as well as globally with multinationals that are providing these advanced energy components. So one of the functions of the lab system is to work through the standards bodies, through the IEEE, through the International Electric Code, to make sure that as we're developing innovations in our laboratories, those are feeding into the standard setting process so that device manufacturer A and device manufacturer B can work on their innovations and steward their proprietary secret sauce, but at the end of the day, they all hook into the same grid, and all do so in a very similar way.
Okay, gentleman in the back here, I think, and then we'll have time for perhaps one or two more questions.
My name is John Topping with the Climate Institute. And this is a
Can you hold the mic a little closer?
This is a question to the whole, anyone on the panel would like to respond. What are we doing to look at the threat of EMP, whether it be EMP attacks, a North Korean high-altitude bomb delivered by an ICBM over the central part of the U.S., or a Carrington-style 1859 solar event?
My answer to that would be in the context of the Benz report on microgrids at military installations. We did talk about, we did raise the following concept, and that is that we might want to create a strategic electricity reserve in this country along the lines of the strategic petroleum reserve. And we would do that by positioning pretty large turbine gen sets on military bases in secure locations that would be protected against the pulse. And then those gen sets would be moved to locations that were affected in a shutdown caused by EMP or something else. Now, that's a possible solution to a very isolated, geographically isolated issue. But insofar as I know, that's the only concrete recommendation I've seen. Now, the utilities in the United States do have a strategic transformer reserve, which has been partially funded by the utilities and partially funded by the government. One of the weak links in the system, and one of the links that is, very exposed to all sorts of disasters, including EMP, would be the main distribution nodes and the very, very heavy transformers. So there has already been some investment in the acquisition and pre-positioning of a number of these generators. And in fact, there has been some expenditure in improving rail transportation capability to move these things to places they might be needed in that event. But again, these are, so far at least, very small steps against a problem that's probably highly unlikely, in my view, but also really difficult to predict the location of. That's all I know.
Yeah, there are also not involved in the grid consortium work that I described earlier, but as part of the body of work that the department funds at the national labs, there are modeling and simulation studies of different scenarios to try to understand where and how the impacts to the grid will come. And then some of the labs, including my own, have hardware facilities where we can subject equipment to pulses of this type and actually explore the failure scenarios and think about ways to remedy them. One of the more interesting things that I've heard, but hasn't been started yet, is how you bring something like additive manufacturing, 3D printing, to allowing you to more quickly fabricate new transformers, new wires, new power electronics components. If we can 3D print a car and we can 3D print a house, then why can't we print a transformer too? And that's something that we're actively looking into.
Oh, there's one other thing. I just wanted to mention it to you. I remember that I was on a Ben's sponsored visit to a military base in the United States about a year ago, and I did see a completely hardened electric grid at that base that was there to operate a particular defensive weapon in the event of EMP followed by something even more lethal. At great expense, by the way. It was pretty expensive, but it should work.
Okay, last question in the back.
Hello, my name is Igor Vergemert. I'm from SimCI in the Netherlands. We are, according to Peter Diamandis, we're going towards a future where the energy will be abundant. So there will be more energy than we consume. And my observation from the whole panel, it's in the business model, because we need to replace the components in the entire grid. We don't have the cash to do that. So we have to rethink and reconfigure how, let's say, small companies, but also consumers can actually produce goods and basically turn it around. So the surplus of energy becomes a production factor. Let me elaborate a little bit more on that. We are connected to Germany, and Germany is producing more solar power than we can manage. So sometimes the cables are really frying, and you can see it from space on the infrared spectrum. And this surplus of energy is not very useful. But suppose you create a factory which is only switching on if this energy is available. That is really a competitive advantage. And your microgrid becomes a monetization connection. That's what I want to add.
So I had the privilege earlier in the year to visit the Netherlands and the new hybrid energy systems integration facility up in the north of Netherlands, supported by the TNO. And it's a facility that we're partnering with. Our laboratory provides very similar systems integration capabilities along the lines of what Jeff was describing. And one of the things that we agree on is that whereas in the history of the grid to date, we have managed the supply to meet the demand, we now have the opportunity with new devices and power electronics to actually go the other way at the same time, to manage the demand to meet the supply. And if you think about a world where we're producing more electricity with wind and with solar resources that have no inherent fuel cost, that are mostly a capital investment, not a fuel investment, unlike fossil plants, nuclear plants to some extent that have a fuel cost associated with them, that actually changes the game in the marketplace such that as you produce more and more electricity from these resources, your marginal cost is near zero. So that kind of upends the way in which we've priced electricity and by extension energy for the last century plus. You can start to think about flat rate plans and nights and weekends free like they're already doing
in Texas. You can think about energy services that combine not just the plug loads, but your mobility through the electric vehicle, your heating and cooling through the waste heat that doesn't leave the premise, your water, as I mentioned earlier, through gray water recycling. And when you do that, you now start thinking about a business model that looks at all of our energy expenditures, not just the power company, the gasoline station, and so on. And you can find a whole lot of value in between the couch cushions if you look hard enough.
Wow. Well, I want to ask you all to join me in thanking our terrific panel today and for an excellent discussion.